Welcome to RPG PhD, where we break down the art and science of tabletop role-playing games. I'm Dr. Ben, and today we're talking about one of the most powerful tools in RPG design, failure. That's right, we're going to explore how you can design failure to drive the story, spark creative choices, and make every misstep feel like an opportunity instead of a dead end. Whether you're building your own system or tweaking an existing one, we'll look at examples from The Burning Wheel, Apocalypse World, Dungeons & Dragons, and more to show how failure can be fun, dramatic, and deeply engaging. Failure is not just inevitable in tabletop RPGs, it's essential. In a well-designed game, failed rolls and setbacks provoke creativity, heighten the stakes, and drive the adventure in interesting directions. Think about your favorite stories. If the heroes succeeded at everything with ease, the tale would fall flat. As one game designer put it, failure provides the complications that make the characters' lives interesting. It provides their dramatic tension. If the PCs always succeed, the game really loses something. In other words, an adventure without meaningful failure is inherently worse than one with it. Embracing failure as a narrative feature rather than a roadblock is key to designing dramatic, momentum-driven RPGs. Aspiring designers should treat failure as an opportunity. A failed attempt shouldn't make the table groan and the story stall. Instead, it can introduce a twist, a new challenge, or an unexpected consequence that propels the story forward. RPG systems, from traditional Dungeons & Dragons to indie games like Apocalypse World and Blades in the Dark, have all grappled with this idea. The goal is to make sure that when things go wrong, the game gets even more interesting. One of the most important concepts in modern RPG design is failing forward. Failing forward means that a failure does not halt the story's progress, but instead introduces a new development or complication for the players to deal with. Crucially, this doesn't mean failure is glossed over or made trivial. The characters might still lose in the short term, but that loss creates future drama rather than a dead end. The narrative moves ahead because of the failures. In RPG terms, failing forward can take many forms. For example, if the rogue fails to pick a lock, don't just say you fail and nothing happens. Instead, describe how their lockpick snaps as the door swings open. The mission can continue, but now perhaps an alarm is quietly triggered, or they can't relock the door behind them. The mechanical result was a failure, but in the game world, it's interpreted as a success with a costly twist. The story keeps moving, the players got through the door, yet a new threat or timer looms. Maybe guards are alerted, or the tools are broken. By complicating rather than blocking the player's efforts, you maintain momentum. Many games explicitly build this principle in. Blades in the Dark is structured so that a bad roll means the story gets more interesting rather than simply nothing happening. There's almost always some forward movement, even on a full failure. The game's GM is encouraged to introduce a twist or danger instead of a hard stop. As one commenter succinctly described, a bad roll means the story gets more interesting rather than simply nothing happening. This approach contrasts with some older binary systems where a failed check might be a closed door, literally and figuratively. Messing up in D&D will generally slam a door shut. You botch your roll and jam the lock. Game over for that route. Fail-forward design avoids such dead ends. Always ask what happens now after a failure. If a plan or action fails, present a new development. The situation changes, the stakes rise, or the goal shifts. This might mean no retries on the same approach. The players might try something different. Kick down the door, find another entrance, bribe someone for a key. Each new path creates interest. Failing to pick the lock might lead the party to try seducing the housekeeper or scaling a wall, outcomes potentially more interesting than if they'd simply strolled through the door. By disallowing rote retries and instead changing the circumstances on a failure, you ensure the story keeps evolving. The key is that failure should generate a consequence or obstacle that the players can react to, not a permanent brick wall. In short, never let a failed roll be the end of the scene. Let it be the beginning of a new twist. One powerful way to design dramatic failure is to move beyond binary outcomes. Many modern games use degrees of success or partial success mechanics that provide outcomes between total success and total failure. These yes but results ensure that even a failed roll often yields something interesting. The Powered by the Apocalypse engine, originating with Apocalypse World, popularized the idea of three-tiered results. On a 2d6 roll, a 10 plus equals a full success, a 7 to 9 is a success with a complication or cost, and 6 is a failure, often with a twist. For example, in Dungeon World, if you roll a 7 to 9 to hack a monster, you hit it, but the enemy also gets a hit on you in return. On a 6 or less, you miss and you're in trouble. But importantly, the Dungeon World rules state, on a 6, something bad happens and you mark XP. The player still learns something from the failure, both narratively and mechanically via experience points. This structure means a huge portion of outcomes are those middle results, where the character achieves their goal partially or at a price. It keeps gameplay unpredictable and exciting. Even success isn't free, and even failure isn't absolute. Many games have their own spin on this idea. Blades in the Dark uses a d6 pool where outcomes are 6 equals a full success, 4 to 5 equals success with a complication, 1 to 3 things go awry. This baked-in structure actively harnesses failure and uses it as narrative fuel to propel the story forward. For instance, you might pick the lock on a 4 to 5, but a patrolling guard shows up behind you as you do. Blades also formalizes the severity of consequences via the character's position, controlled, risky, or desperate. Failing a desperate action is dire, but it also grants you XP for your troubles, rewarding you for taking big risks. The game's underlying thesis is that it's far more fun for the characters to work their way out of trouble than it is to avoid it in the first place. In other words, trouble creates drama, and the mechanics ensure trouble happens frequently in small doses. Apocalypse World Monster of the Week, on a miss, 6 or below, the GM is instructed to make a hard move, essentially introduce a new problem or danger. The player doesn't get what they wanted and things get more complicated. But this is not framed as punishment, rather as the GM's opportunity to propel the fiction. Powered by the Apocalypse, GMs are encouraged to think failing forward here as well. Even failures drive the story forward and make the characters' lives interesting. Notably, many Powered by the Apocalypse games give the player a small reward for misses, mark XP on a failure in Dungeon World, or get a point of luck in Monster of the Week. This softens the sting and signals to players that failure is a valued part of the narrative cycle. Characters learn from mistakes or get a resource to use later. The Genesis Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars system. This system uses unique narrative dice that generate two axes of outcome, success versus failure and advantage versus threat. This means you can roll success with threat, you succeed but something bad also happens, or failure with advantage, you fail at the task but some good side effect occurs. For example, your blaster shot misses the enemy, failure, but you notice a control panel nearby that you can use to your advantage. Perhaps you failed to damage the foe, but you shoot out the lights, plunging the room into darkness, so you can escape. Conversely, you might succeed in picking the vault lock, but generate a threat. So the GM declares the lock opens after triggering a silent alarm. The Genesis dice system essentially guarantees mixed outcomes are common, and it prompts players and GMs to interpret the narrative twists on the fly. The result is that failure often feels more like a scene change than a stop sign. Fate uses a simpler skill check, but explicitly allows the option to succeed at a cost. If a player roll fails, the GM can offer success anyway, but introduce a cost or complication to pay for it. For instance, if you fail to leap across a chasm, the GM might say, you can make it to the other side if you're willing to drop your backpack and all the loot that's inside it, to gain a little more distance. Do you do it? This gives the player agency in deciding how failure manifests. They could accept the failure, falling short and hanging off the ledge perhaps, or succeed with the costly trade-off. Fate also has compels a character aspects, where a player earns a fate point in exchange for a complication happening. In effect, choosing a setback because it makes the story more interesting, and they get a resource reward to boot. These mechanics make failure and complication a choice or a currency, not merely a loss. D&D traditionally uses binary pass-fail D20 rolls, but even here designers and dungeon masters have introduced degrees of success. The Dungeon Master's Guide suggests that a natural 1 on a check could mean a worse outcome, tools breaking on a failed lockpick attempt, for example, and a natural 20 could mean an added benefit. Some DMs implement house rules for partial successes, like if you fail a check by only 1 or 2, you succeed but with a complication. D&D 4e's skill challenges were an attempt to formalize failing forward. Even if the party failed some rolls, the challenge continued until a threshold, and failures would add complications or extra encounters rather than immediately ending the scenario. For example, failing a couple of rolls in a chase might mean you still catch the villain, but you arrive exhausted and cornered by his henchmen. In D&D 5e, many DMs simply adopt the mindset of fail forward in their narration, ensuring that a failed investigation check doesn't mean you find nothing, the story halts, but rather you didn't find the clue here, but you do notice muddy footprints leading out of the window, giving the players a new lead. The principle of 3 clues from Justin Alexander's GM advice is often applied. Always have multiple ways for the party to get important information, so a single failure won't block the plot. In short, even games without built-in partial successes mechanics can benefit from designing scenarios and roles with a spectrum of outcomes in mind. By incorporating partial successes, mixed outcomes, and graded failure states in your game design, you ensure that almost every role furthers the story in some way. The players learn to expect interesting twists rather than binary yes-no results. This keeps them engaged and thinking creatively. Okay, I succeeded, but what's the catch? Or I failed, but what silver lining can I grab onto? It also injects tension into every role. Even victory might come at a price, and even defeat might open a new door. When designing failure outcomes, meaningfulness is key. A failure should have consequences that matter to the story or the characters, but it should not feel like the game is purely punishing the players or stymieing their fun. The art is finding that sweet spot where the players think, wow, things just got complicated, instead of, well, guess we can't do anything now. Failing forward, as discussed, is one approach to ensure meaning. The failure creates a new situation to tackle, effectively escalating or evolving the narrative rather than nullifying player effort. In contrast, a punitive failure might be something like simply losing a key item or taking heavy damage with no narrative payoff. It hurts, but doesn't hook into the ongoing plot. Aim for the former whenever possible. Consider using complications that spark action. In a heist scenario, a failed stealth roll could add a ticking clock. Guards are alerted and will arrive in 3 minutes. Or introduce a new problem. The gadget you were using malfunctions, attracting unwanted attention. Games like Blades in the Dark formalize this with progress clocks. A failure might fill segments on an alarm raised clock, inching the crew closer to a bad outcome. But until that clock fills completely, the game isn't over. It's just getting more tense. This is an excellent design pattern, gradually escalating stakes as failures accumulate, rather than an immediate catastrophe on the first flub. It gives players feedback. Uh-oh, we're running out of time or cover and chances to respond, which keeps them involved in the story. Justin Alexander also notes that using a progress clock provides a default consequence for failing forward. If you can't think of a unique complication, just tick the clock and describe how things move closer to danger. Another principle is to ensure the possibility of recovery or alternative success. As one designer wrote, the secret sauce of failing forward is the promise that the failure can be dealt with or made right eventually. In other words, the game should allow characters to rebound from setbacks. If a failure permanently cripples a character's progression or the overall storyline with no chance to adapt, players may grow frustrated or cautious to a fault. However, if they know failures create interesting problems that will get opportunities to solve, they will be more willing to take risks and roll with failures. Systems like Burning Wheel build this philosophy into their DNA. Characters advance by overcoming challenges, and even failures give Artha reward points or lead to situations that test beliefs, which is where character growth happens. In fact, Burning Wheel's advancement mechanics require a mix of successful and failed tests to improve a skill, explicitly reinforcing that you learn through failure. Designing your game with such feedback loops where failure today sets up triumph tomorrow makes failures feel meaningful, not hopeless. Also, consider rewarding failure in some way as odd as that sounds. We've mentioned Dungeon World marking XP on a miss. Other games might give out a narrative token or resource where things can go wrong. For example, in some systems, players earn a hero point or similar meta currency when their character is dealt a setback. They can later spend that to tip the odds in their favor. Fate points via compels work like this, or do inspiration points in D&D 5e if a DM uses them to reward good role-playing, introducing dramatic failures. This kind of mechanic sends a clear message. Failure is part of the game's fun, and the system acknowledges and balances it by empowering the player in another way. It helps failure feel less like purely bad luck and more like a dramatic beat in the story arc, after which the heroes come back stronger or wiser. That said, be careful not to make failure more punishing than failure. That sounds paradoxical, but a common mistake is overcomplicating failing forward to the point players say, I'd rather just fail cleanly. For example, if every failed lockpick in your game always means you still open the lock but your tools break, an alarm sounds, and you take damage, players might feel that's actually worse than just failing and trying again. One player commented that having lockpicks break on a failed check felt more punishing and deeply unfair than a simple failure. The takeaway is scale your consequences to the context and stakes. Not every miss needs to trigger a disaster. Sometimes a minor setback is enough. Many games use soft versus hard moves, a concept from the Powered by the Apocalypse. A soft complication is a warning or minor problem. A hard complication is a dire outcome. Use a mix appropriate to the situation and the genre. If the heroes are in the early stages of an adventure, failures might mostly be soft, setting up challenges. As the climax nears, failures can hit harder. Gauge what feels fun versus frustrating. A good practice is to offer choice when a failure consequence is severe. Do your picks break, or do you give up on the lock for now and try another approach? This ties into player agency, which we discuss next. By involving players in the outcome, you avoid the feeling of arbitrariness and let them decide which bad result they find more palpable. In short, design consequences that fit the crime or the failed role and err on the side of drama over punishment. If the players shake their heads with a nervous grin and say, oh man, now we've got a mess to deal with, you're doing it right. If they just feel penalized, I guess my character is worse off and we got nothing for it, consider tweaking your failure outcomes to be more engaging. Even though failure introduces adversity, players should still feel empowered in how the story unfolds. Great RPG systems give players some agency in failure, whether that's in narrating the flop, mitigating its effects, or making meaningful choices in response. This keeps failure from feeling like a loss of control. Instead, it becomes a collaborative story moment. Here are some ways to bake player agency into failure design. Allow players to contribute to the narrative of failure. Rather than the game master always dictating what a failure looks like, invite the player to describe how things go awry. For example, in a tabletop session, a player might dramatically act out how their spell misfires, or their sword swing goes wild. This turns failure into a chance for player creativity and humor. A DM or system could have a guideline on a critical failure. The player describes the mishap, with the GM's final say. Many players will relish the chance to narrate an epic blunder. As one D&D commenter said, it's wholly more satisfying when the DM lets me describe how my character fails. It softens the sting and gives a sense of ownership. The failure becomes part of your character's story, not just an abstract punishment. Offer choices at the moment of failure. We touched on fate succeed at a cost, which is essentially a choice: take the win with a complication or accept the loss. This concept can be generalized. When something goes wrong, give the player a choice of bad outcomes. For instance, in a pulp adventure game, if the hero fails to disarm the bomb in time, the GM could say, okay, you can save everyone else, but you'll be caught in the explosion, or you can dive for cover and survive, but some innocents get hurt. What do you do? This way, the player's values and priorities come into play, and the failure becomes a meaningful character moment. Some Powered by the Apocalypse moves do this by providing a list of complications to choose from on a 7 to 9 result. In Hydro Hacker Operatives, a player who partially succeeds at a social come-across move picks how they're annoyed. The game shares narrative control. The player picks the flavor of trouble and the GM incorporates it. The player feels involved in crafting the setback rather than having it unilaterally imposed. Incentivize risk-taking with meta mechanics. If players have resources that can avert failure, it paradoxically empowers them to embrace risky situations. For example, in Call of Cthulhu or Dungeon Crawl Classics, a player might have luck points to re-roll or modify a bad outcome, but those resources are limited. Knowing they have a safety net, players might attempt daring moves, since a bad roll isn't necessarily final. In Blades in the Dark, players can choose to resist a consequence by spending stress, essentially negating or reducing the severity of a failure's fallout. However, this comes at the cost of stress, which could impair them later. The design lesson is giving players a way to say, not this failure, not now, lets them decide which failures are dramatically appropriate and which would be just too disruptive. They become editors of the story's pacing. Original designers can incorporate mechanics like luck, rewind, second winds, hero points, or other pressure valves. Just use them carefully. If failure is too easily negated, it loses its teeth. The trick is to make mitigating a failure a meaningful choice, not an automatic button. For instance, Genesis lets players spend advantage to have something positive happen even on a failure, which isn't a full negation, but gives them agencies to steer the narrative towards something useful even as they fail. Highlight character growth from failure. Players feel agency when their failures tie into their character development. A system might have a mechanic like fail forward into character growth. We've talked about XP on failure. Beyond that, consider specific moves or traits that trigger on failure. Dungeon World's end of session move asks if you learned something new or failed in an interesting way, and you get XP for that. Other indie games have things like when you dramatically fail at a goal related to your drive, mark a point of drive. Essentially, rewarding failures that align with characterization. This way, players can almost aim their failures in directions that tell the story they want. They might take a risky action because it would be really interesting for their hot-headed character to mess up and face the consequences, potentially earning XP or a new trait, a rival or a scar out of it. By tying failure to the character's arc, you make it feel purposeful. A great example is Burning Wheel's belief and Artha system. When a character pursues their belief and things go wrong, the player earns Artha, which can be spent to succeed in clutch moments. The failure then isn't just a setback, it is literal fuel for the character's later heroism, a part of their legend. Designing for player agency in failure means making sure the players are active participants in those dark moments, not just passive victims. Whether through narrative control, choices, or meta resources, give them tools to engage with failure creatively. This transforms failure from something bad that happened to my character into an exciting challenge or plot twist we created together. When players have agency, failure scenes often become the most memorable stories told about the game. Just think of all the hilarious critical fail stories or the time a player's bad decision led to a thrilling chase. Those are the moments groups talk about for years to come. So how can you, as an inspiring RPG designer, incorporate these ideas into an original system? Here's a summary of some concrete design principles for failure that you can apply to any game, whether it's a high-crunch combat simulator or a free-form storytelling game. Design your resolution mechanics so that a failed check changes the situation instead of ending it. Ensure that every failure introduces a new detail, complication, or consequence that the players can react to. This might mean adding explicit fail-forward rules. On a failure, the GM will introduce a twist or reduce the success to a partial success with a cost, rather than saying the action simply didn't happen. Remember, failures can and should help generate new situations, the same way situations generated by successes could. Even if your game uses simple pass-fail rolls, include plenty of guidance and examples for GMs on how to turn a failure into a plot development. Encourage scenario design with multiple possible routes so that one failed approach doesn't doom the adventure. Whenever possible, move beyond pure binary outcomes. Consider using graded results like the 3-tier Powered by the Apocalypse model or a dice pool with varying thresholds so that partial successes and partial failures are part of the system's core. This inherently bakes yes but thinking into your game. Players and GMs will automatically start narrating the "you succeed but there's a catch" or "you fail but there's something good amid the bad outcomes" because the dice or mechanics lead them there. As an example, design skill checks with sliding outcomes. Maybe a high roll gets exactly what the player wants, a middling roll gets it with complications, and a low roll means they don't get what they want, but something else happens. By defining these in rules, you ensure consistent fail-forward play. Many games, powered by the Apocalypse, Fate, Genesis, Shadowrun, Over the Edge, Forged in the Dark, already do this. So study how they phrase these outcomes and adapt to your design. Even D&D 5e's advantage, disadvantage, or the optional critical success failure rules hint at degrees. You can push that further in your own system. Design default consequences for failure. This could be as simple as losing resources, time, ammo, stamina, or increasing danger. Alert level rises, enemies get closer, environment worsens. The key is that a failed action should still produce an outcome in the game world. For instance, failing a diplomacy check might lower the NPC's attitude or make them demand a bribe rather than ending the negotiation outright. A failed climbing attempt might mean you fall and take harm, but now the environment has changed, the rope is frayed, or you've made noise. One concrete technique is borrowing progress clocks or counters to find a clock for an enemy suspicion or an impending disaster, and on failures, tick it forward. This externalizes failure consequences in a way players can see. The doom clock is filling up. Something that they can see and respond to. It also ensures failures are moving some dial in the game. A meaningful consequence can even be success at a cost. Let the action succeed, but introduce a complication. This way, the plot still advances. They achieve the immediate goal, but with a new wrinkle to deal with. Always design a way out or a next step after a consequence. Players should feel, all right, what do we do about this new problem? Instead of, we're screwed with no recourse. Encourage players to not avoid failure by giving them compensation for failing. This could be experience points, as in Dungeon World, or another form of advancement. It could be narrative currency, a hero point, a narrative twist they can introduce later. The reward doesn't have to fully outweigh the cost of failure, but it should take some sting out and signal failing is part of play. You'll get something out of it. For example, you might implement, when you fail a roll, gain 1 determination. You can spend 3 determination to turn any future failed roll into a success. Another approach is making failure fun through the fiction, a GM intrusions mechanic from Monty Cook's Cipher system, where the GM deliberately causes a complication, essentially a failure or twist, and gives the player an XP for accepting it. When players see failure leading to cool drama and tangible rewards, they'll fear it less and engage more. Build in mechanics for player agency when things go wrong. This can be literal, like a Fate-style succeed at a cost option, or a dramatic edit players can invoke to soften a failure. It can also be cultural, like encouraging GMs to ask players, how do you fail? Or what do you think happens instead on a miss? If designing a narrative-heavy game, you might include prompts in the rules. On a failure, the GM describes what goes wrong or asks the player to describe how their attempt fails. For a more gamist approach, maybe give players a limited resource to influence failures. Luck rerolls, or the ability to deny one GM intrusion per session if they don't like a particular failure outcome. By giving a measure of control, you ensure the players feel involved in shaping the story, even when fate isn't on their side. This also alleviates the sense of the GM is out to get us when bad things happen, because often the players themselves help shape that bad thing. It's a cooperative storytelling mindset. Consider the role of failure in your game's genre and tone. In a comedic game, failures might be frequent and absurd, and that's fine, it fits. In a heroic epic, you might want failures to be less common, but more meaningful when they occur. The tragic setback before the comeback. Ensure your failure design supports the feeling that you want. For example, in Powered by the Apocalypse games, lean heavily into genre by tailoring their complications to genre tropes. If you're designing a noir detective game, failure might often mean complications, like a new suspect appearing, or the detective getting roughed up, things that drive the mystery deeper as opposed to just not finding a clue. In a high fantasy adventure, failure could mean a cost to be paid, a magical bargain, a loss of a valued item, an ally wounded, which sets up the next quest. Always ask, what do players expect from failure in this genre, and how can my game deliver that in a satisfying way? If the genre expects heroes to ultimately win, design failures to be setbacks they can overcome. If the genre courts tragedy, like a greedy horror game, then failures can accumulate to dire outcomes. But even then, give players the meaningful choices about how they face that doom. Finally, when your system is in development, play test specifically for the failure mechanics. Watch players' reactions when things go wrong. Are they having fun dealing with the fallout, or do they seem annoyed and discouraged? If players start deliberately avoiding rolls or overly optimizing to never fail, that might be a sign your failure consequences are too harsh or too boring. Ideally, you'll see players leaning forward when they fail, eager to see what happens next. They might even laugh or cheer at a spectacular failure because they know it makes the story juicier. Aim for that response. Tweak probabilities if needed. Certain games calibrate the dice probabilities so that the partial success, the interesting mix result, is the most common outcome, about 40% of rolls, let's say. Adjust the risk-reward balance of any meta-currencies. If players never spend their avoid failure tokens, maybe failure isn't scary enough. If they burn through everything to avoid failing, maybe dial back the penalties. Use feedback to fine-tune how failure feels in your game until it consistently promotes drama, story momentum, and creativity as intended. In a well-designed tabletop RPG, failure is never the end of the story, it's a plot twist. As you craft your game, keep failure at the forefront of your design considerations. Make it interesting. Make it integral to the experience, whether through fail-forward mechanics, partial successes, inventive complications, or player-driven outcomes. Treat every failed roll as an invitation. Something unexpected is about to happen. The best RPG moments often come from things going wrong in just the right way. As a designer, you have the power to engineer those moments. There is no single formula, but the underlying philosophy is consistent. Failure should feel meaningful, not merely punitive. It should engage the players rather than exclude them. It should make the story better, even if it makes life harder for the characters. Aspiring designers don't fear failure. In fact, design for it. If you do, you'll create games where players push their limits, take bold risks, and delight in the dramatic twists that follow. Your players will remember the epic defeats and costly victories just as much as the flawless wins. In the collaborative storytelling of tabletop RPGs, failure is not just falling down, it's the first step in a thrilling new direction. So let your players fail, and let them fail forward into adventure. If you enjoyed this deep dive into designing failure that moves your story forward, hit that like button and consider subscribing for more videos on game design, storytelling, and the craft of RPGs. And if you've got thoughts on how you've used failure in your own games, good, bad, or glorious, I would love to hear them in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.